A few months ago, Maria Miller said the idea of a crisis in the cultural sector was laughable, and I think that made quite a few people sit up and pay attention. So the title of today's discussion is Crisis, What Crisis? And we have two speakers, David Fleming, the Director of National Museums Liverpool, and Peter Bazalgette, the Chair of the Arts Council. I'm not going to do long introductions to either of them because I think probably most delegates are familiar with who they are. They're both going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions and comments and discussion from the audience. So be thinking through the points that you want to make. So I'll introduce now David Fleming, the Director of National Museums Liverpool.
Good morning, everybody. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to pay respect to Peter Bazalgette for agreeing to this debate. It would have been easy for him to back out and send somebody else or, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a bit of respect there for entering the bear pit, which is the MA conference in Liverpool. I think the first thing I want to say is a few comments about my credentials for saying anything. Because if I've got a view on this, whether or not there's a crisis, I think it's important that we understand where I'm coming from. I've been working in museums for 32 years. I've worked in independent, university, local authority and national museums, so I've been across pretty much the spectrum. I've been trustee of 2 museums and an art centre. I've been chairman of the Social History Curators Group, chairman of the Museum Professionals Group, president of the MA, 3 times on the MA board. I've even been a member of the National Audit Office's expert panel on museums and galleries' self-generated income. I confess I don't remember much about it, but apparently I was on it. Etc., etc. Currently, I'm Director of National Museums Liverpool and former Director of Tyne and Wear Museums, as then was Tyne and Wear Museums and Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, or whatever it's called now, Ian. I've been around the block a few times. I'm also Vice President of the Museums Association. Now, for many of those 32 years, I've found myself arguing the case for public and private funding for museums on the basic grounds that museums are so important from so many cultural, social and economic points of view that they mustn't sit on a list or a shelf marked can be sacrificed when times get tough, or on a shelf marked not very important, someone else can pay for this. Now, during most of this period, I've been able to help protect museum budgets and help create socially purposeful museum services in a number of northern cities that have been suffering post-industrial stress, high unemployment, poverty, high incidence of poverty-related disease, low educational attainment, high crime rates, etc., etc. That's where I come from. I'm speaking of cities like Leeds, Hull, Newcastle upon Tyne, Sunderland and latterly Liverpool, where the post-industrial, post-empire decline was so severe that the city almost went bust in the 1980s. Over that period, there have been recurrent problems, notably cuts in public funding. They just keep coming back. But right now, I have to say the funding situation is the worst I've ever seen. So, Peter, I believe there is a crisis, and I suspect that most of the people in this room agree with me. I suspect you might as well. We'll see. If they're right, if I'm right, this is a huge challenge, particularly, I think, for the Arts Council, which is now the government's nominated body to look after our sector. And I use the words look after quite consciously. Let's hear what our international colleagues are saying, just by way of a little bit of context. Fairly recently, the National Committee of European Countries, ICOM committees, made an appeal to the European Parliament and Commission for Parliaments and Governments, blah, blah, blah. What they said was, we would like to point out that in many countries of Europe and European Union, the economic crisis is producing dramatic effects upon cultural activities and museums. In many European countries, economic crisis has generated a drastic decrease in public and private financial support for culture and museums. These drastic cuts are endangering the existence of many museums and their collections and threatening the working conditions of professionals, particularly younger ones. Colleagues are losing their jobs and young professionals are underpaid, have only short-term precarious contracts or cannot find suitable employment. Does this sound familiar? Because this is coming from Italy and other countries. With great concern, we have already seen museums that had to reduce opening hours and activities or even being forced to close because lack of resources. Others are now losing their directors and technical teams. Policymakers need to recognise that museums are long-term, intergenerational institutions where research, conservation and dissemination of knowledge are closely entwined. None of these functions should be neglected. Culture and museums are important investments for a better society, not liabilities to be cut down in times of crisis. Culture, heritage and museums in particular drive economic and social growth as well as innovation and community cohesion. Even in countries facing serious economic problems, museums and heritage should be financed so they can continue to contribute to social cohesion and development. And so it goes on. Now, perhaps we don't need to worry about what's happening across the Channel, but what might a UK crisis look like? Well, according to the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, ALVA, and DCMS's own Taking Part survey, visitor numbers are rising. And until recently, we were able to say the same in Liverpool. But as Maurice Davies wrote in June, maybe we ain't seen nothing yet. Where's Maurice? He's here somewhere. I'm going to quote your infamous blog. If you don't read Maurice's blogs, you should. He wrote in June, whatever the message is, the stark fact is that the recent cuts in public funding for museums are unprecedented. It's remarkable that there's a sense of relief in English national museums that they're going to be cut by only a further 5%, when this means their government grants will have been cut by over 25% by 2016. And local authorities in England will have lost a third of their funding by 2016. It's hard to see how they will cope with their statutory services, let alone museums. I'll come back to that in a minute. Beyond that, consider these 3 points. First, many of the things being achieved by museums are based on work undertaken years ago, before the cuts. Good point, Maurice. Absolutely right. There's a momentum that museums have been building for a number of years, and the cuts that started in 2010 are only starting to bite now. That momentum kept a lot of us going, certainly kept us going in Liverpool. Second, museums are getting more audience and community focus, and it's paying dividends. Third, and this is the most worrying, we ain't seen nothing yet. The cuts have a lot further to go. Many museums have only had the first instalment of their cuts. They know there are more ahead and that the worst is yet to come. Most museums may not be in crisis yet, but they know that one is looming. Maybe the crisis is only outside London. If we are to draw conclusions from the Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital report published last week and featuring very powerfully in David Anderson's presidential address yesterday, I see from the MA website that the Arts Council disputes the figures in the report. I have to say I was a little disappointed at that initial reaction, that the figures are wrong. I suspect they're not wrong. Just supposing the figures are correct, what did the Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital report? I'm assuming actually that many of you in the room won't have read this report yet because it's still quite new. So I'll quote from a briefing note that came out on the 31st of October. Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital is an evidence-based report addressing the balance of arts funds as between London and the rest of England, published on the 31st of October. These are the headlines. 15% of the population of England lives in London. In 2012-13, Arts Council England distributed £320 million of taxpayers' money to the arts, with £20 per head of population allocated in London against £3.60 per head of population in the rest of England. I don't know if these are the figures that the Arts Council disputes. In the same year, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport distributed £450 million of public funds from the same source directly to major national cultural institutions, with, the report estimates, £49 per head of population in London against £1 per head of population in the rest of the country. These figures shocked even me. For years, I've sensed the imbalance in funding. Remember what I said earlier on, I've spent all my career working in the north. I've sensed it, but nobody's ever shown me the figures before. There are some figures available now, and they're absolutely damning. In total, in 2012-13, taxpayers from the whole of England provided benefit to London of £69 per head against £4.60 per head in the rest of the country. These figures aren't even anywhere near worth arguing about. A pattern of public funding that favours London has existed since the foundation of the Arts Council. A trend to enhance the imbalance has been consistent for at least 30 years. During this period, successive governments and arts councils have acknowledged the imbalance but argued that it would need a significant new injection of funds to enable redress. Since 1995, Arts Council England has had stewardship responsibility for and has distributed £3.5 billion of new and additional funds for good causes in the arts from the National Lottery. The report argues that funds from the lottery, derived disproportionately from the less well-off in society, carry a different ethical mandate for the Arts Council. This suggests at least geographically proportionate distribution based on size of population. In fact, Arts Council distribution of its £3.5 billion of new lottery funding has provided benefit to London of £165 per head against £47 per head of population in England over the 18 years of lottery to date. Last year's figures, combining taxpayers and lottery players' funds distributed by the Arts Council England, show benefit to London of £86 per head against £8 per head in the rest of England, a ratio of over 10 to 1. Melvyn Bragg, somebody who I've never found myself quoting before, but I will now. This report is timely, urgent and damning of an increasingly centralised funding process. London is simply eating up the resources which are limited and therefore starving the rest of the country. This is wrong, short-sighted and undoubtedly unfair. I think it's time that the rest of England fought back, and I wholly support the contents of rebalancing our culture capital. A couple of quotes from the authors of the report. One, David Powell, said, and I don't know either of these people, "As a Londoner, my instinct has long been that there was inequity between London and the rest of England. But on close inspection, the historical and current record looks pretty shocking, even when making due allowance for the additional investment in national and international infrastructure proper to a capital, which is one of the world's great cities." Christopher Gordon, one of the other authors, said, "It really doesn't have to be like this. Even in so centrally designed an authoritarian state as France, the balance between national, regional and local government roles in setting and carrying out coherent cultural policy is a proper subject for debate in both the National Assembly and the Senate, and that balance can and does change from time to time. But the UK's combination of local government with few effective constitutional guarantees and cultural funding being predominantly decided by arm's-length bodies results in both strategy and equity being off the political agenda in England. Who takes responsibility for and makes sense of the big picture? Answer, nobody. Having no policy is not a justifiable policy. Britain's more autonomous and confident local authorities in the 19th century, backed by local philanthropists, created much of the infrastructure outside London that we still use today. It's now under greater pressure peacetime threat than at any time in the last 150 years. So who's speaking up about the crisis? Who isn't? And why aren't they speaking up? Well, the Museums Association is speaking up, I'm very pleased to say, and the MA has been collating information for some time on the impact that funding cuts are having across the nations. I will share with you briefly some of what the BBC website reported on the MA survey last month. More than a third of museums and galleries cut staff last year, while nearly half increased the number of interns and volunteers, according to the survey. School visits down by 31%, almost a quarter reducing the number of temporary exhibitions. Moving on to the findings themselves. Half of the respondents to the MA Cuts survey experienced a cut to their overall income, 49%. Almost a quarter saw their overall income decrease by more than 10%. Over a fifth of respondents cut staff numbers by over 10%, etc., etc. Okay. But good for the MA for doing that. It's been plugging away for several years now, and nobody's taken much notice of the Cuts survey, and I think it's probably time that we did, because it's becoming cumulative and it's becoming really, really worrying. Now, 3 years ago, some of you may have been there, at the MA conference in Manchester, we had a little debate. It wasn't very different from this, actually. Mike Dixon from the Natural History Museum was one of my fellow panellists. I can't remember who else was there. It's terrible, isn't it? Anyway, what I do remember is sitting there, and excuse my language, but I actually said that the funding crisis was coming and it was going to be shit. And I stand by that. I think I was proven right, as actually things have happened. Other people didn't agree. They seemed to think that somehow or other museums would muddle through, would be okay. We're so good at managing ourselves and adaptability and resilient and all those words that we'll be okay. Well, I'm sorry, but that's defeatist language. When you're under attack, like our sector's under attack, what you don't do is say, we'll be okay. Just keep it coming, please. You stand up and you say, well, actually, these are some of the impacts that we're talking about. We think the nation should be worried about it. And we're not just going to go along with the idea that there's nothing wrong, you know, going quietly into the night, as somebody once said. Let's consider the local government situation. In Liverpool, the mayor says the city could be bankrupt in 2 years. I think that could be a bit of a crisis. Or is it simply not true? Is it just political posturing? Liverpool Mayor Joe Anderson this is from the BBC News, has warned government cuts mean the city could be bankrupt in just over 2 years. Liverpool City Council says it will only have money to run mandatory services such as social care. Mr Anderson said that by 2016-17, the city will be bankrupt. It's that stark a challenge for us. Brandon Lewis, local government minister, said it was scaremongering and the council had a duty to provide services. The council has to save £156 million over the next 3 years, on top of £173 million worth of cuts over the last 3 years. Liverpool spends a quarter of its net budget of £550 million on cultural events, regeneration and leisure centres, despite not having a statutory obligation to do so. Mr Anderson claims that by 2016-17, this money will be needed to pay for adult and children's social care, environmental health, refuse collection and street cleansing, unless circumstances change. He said, I quote Joe, "There is far worse to come and people need to understand that over the next few years we are going to be stopping doing things that we currently take for granted. If we do not, we will simply go bankrupt." Mr Anderson said 80 pence in every pound comes from central government, and because almost half of the funding has been taken, there will be some difficult and tough choices. Mr Lewis, the local government minister, said, I quote, "The Mayor of Liverpool and Labour generally in Liverpool have used this scaremongering year on year now. The reality is Liverpool has one of the highest spends per household anywhere in the country. They've got a city deal, they've got a lot of investment going on there, they've got a duty to provide good quality services. If the Mayor can't do this, it's time for Joe to stand down and let another party have a chance." Local Government Association Chairman Sir Merrick Cockle said, quote, "Local government is nearing crisis point. Councils have been handed the deepest cuts in the public sector and some are nearing the stage where they will be unable to meet their statutory responsibilities. The system of funding local government has to change or things will start to fail." What about National Museums Liverpool? Well, we've been trying to cope with funding cuts for 3 years now. By 2015-16, NML's annual grant in aid will be £3.7 million less than it was in 10-11, and that's if you don't take into account the gap caused by inflation. That's real-time money. Here is some of what's happened in NML in that period. We've closed the National Conservation Centre. National funding has been withdrawn from the Find Your Talent Liverpool City Region Pathfinder. Partnership programmes across Merseyside were immediately affected with the cancellation of all Find Your Talent programmes. We've cancelled the Waterfront Connections project. We've cancelled the project to upgrade and provide improved access to the Canning Dock area, the slightly messy area that you see outside the Museum of Liverpool. We've ended, funding has ended for strategic commissioning programmes engaging refugees and asylum seekers and Understanding Slavery initiative. We've cancelled accessible education programme including British Sign Language interpretation of events. We've cancelled on-gallery storytelling for young families at World Museum. New ancient Greece-themed schools and family sessions have been cancelled. We've lost youth arts programme due to end of external funding and lack of NML resources to embed the officer into the staff line. We've cancelled freelance-led tours for adult group bookings across NML galleries. There's been a major reduction in programming to support special exhibitions, no new materials to enhance Victorian Christmas, family holiday workshops and themed weekends cancelled across NML venues, cancellation of family learning ferry cruise for families from lower socio-economic backgrounds, cancellation or reduction of freelance role plays towards the Pier Masters House, cancellation of International Slavery Museum Theatre in Education programming. I haven't finished. Unable to progress prints and drawings digitisation photography, lack of staff resource and recruitment freeze. Postponement of works to first floor of Museum of Liverpool to accommodate visitor services team. Inability to fund the second scheme of development at the International Slavery Museum. An increase in emergency call-outs for estates team to respond to problems caused by ageing plants and infrastructure. Increased pressure on reactive maintenance revenue budgets due to 50% reduction in capital grant in aid, etc., etc. Cancellation of staff attendance at conferences. Sharon knows all about the deal that we had to try and do here to get any National Museums Liverpool staff along to this conference that weren't giving a paper. Cancellation of study days and seminars, cancellation of subscriptions to professional societies and academic journals, etc., etc., etc. Unable to provide British Sign Language training for staff. A reduction in the number of our volunteers, not an increase. Volunteers need looking after. If you haven't got anybody to look after them, you can't just keep taking them on. That way lies absolute chaos and anarchy, and that's a tragedy. Loss of transport provision for Archaeological Fieldwork unit. Can you imagine how pleased our archaeologists are that we haven't got any transport anymore? Painting and decorating ceased throughout the estate. And one of my favourite indicators, window cleaning has ceased across the whole estate. If you come to any of our offices, you can't see out the windows. Apart from that, we've lost about 90 jobs so far. We're probably about to lose some more. Now, some people may find that laughable. I don't find that particularly laughable myself. I don't think that the idea that this is a big set of problems for us is all that amusing. Now, some people might say that maybe I should go, like Joe should go from Liverpool. We should just go and let somebody else come along and manage it more effectively so that we didn't have to cancel all those things. I'm almost tempted to say, well, come and have a go then, you know. But I'm not going to do that. Now, the results of the cutbacks in activity in National Museums Liverpool are now catching up on us. We're experiencing a 20% fall in visitor numbers this year. So it completely contrasts with what I've been reading about in the Museum's Journal. We reached an all-time high in 2012. So this is more than frustrating that having reached an all-time high, we're now 20% down. And it's not because the Museum of Liverpool is no longer brand new. It's absolutely not to do that. It's because of the cancellation of all those things that I've just been talking about. Some people might think this is an absurd situation. But the fact is, we're doing less because there are fewer of us, because our resources have shrunk. Right, I'm finishing. Much as some people are keen to suggest that either it's business as usual or that museums should be able to augment their income, or that good managers should be able to cope comfortably with restructuring and redirecting their efforts. If they can't do this, they should get out of the way and let someone who can. I don't really go along with that. I don't know how anybody can claim that job losses in the museum sector is of no consequence, that the work all those people did was of no value and will not be missed. There is a crisis. Pretending that there isn't one, wishing it away, isn't going to help resolve it. What we need is some national policy and planning, and I hope the Arts Council can ensure that that's brought about. Now, the introductory music that some of you will have heard was the Manic Street Preachers. If you tolerate this, then your children will be next, and that's the final message I would like to leave you with. We must not go quietly into the night over this and start restructuring, rebalancing our budgets and pretending that everything's okay. Because, Sir Peter, I don't think everything is okay. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think if anything is guaranteed, it's that you won't go quietly into the night. And apologies, there was a sharp burst of Basement Jacks, where's your head at, in the middle of your contribution there, which was what I wanted to have played in this session. Peter, can we hand over to you now?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for your invitation here today. And thank you, David, for your warm and strong and tough opening speech in the debate. Let me respond right away by saying, of course everything's not okay. And who would argue everything's okay? Of course it isn't. And I'll have a lot to say about that today. But I would make a distinction between a challenge, a massive challenge, and a crisis. You mentioned Italy. Italy has a real crisis, and I know a bit about that. And Italy has a real crisis because it's got institutions that have relied 100% on state funding, don't have a diversification of revenue, and don't have the same business plans and forward-thinking that there is in the museum sector here. So Italy genuinely has a crisis. And as to the balance of spending between London and the regions, there's an imbalance. I'll say more about that later. Just before I come to that, in the practice of politics and public affairs today, you're meant to know everything, aren't you? Every media interview assumes you do and is piously shocked if you don't. But I'd just like to say I've been chair of the Arts Council now for 9 months, and I have a lot to learn, which is why I'm grateful for your invitation here today. I'm not only here to speak, but I'm here to listen, and we have got time for Q&A at the end, which will be very valuable for us. On the other hand, I have been involved in arts and culture in my own small way for a couple of decades. I chaired an opera company, and before that, I raised funds for a new museum. Perhaps a quick word to explain the latter. Some of you may know that I suffer from a rare medical condition. I have, it's called sewage in the blood. I refer to my great-great-grandfather, the Victorian engineer Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who designed London's sewage system, which cured London of cholera in the mid-19th century. And I was brought in about 1990 to a group of retired steam engineers who'd got one of his pumping stations. It had the most magnificent rotative steam beam engines, completely in disrepair, and they were restoring one of them, but they had this Grade 1 industrial building around it. The purpose of the building, by the way, have you got the stomach for this at this time of the morning, by the way? His sewage system built parallel sewers to the River Thames, which had become an open sewer, and they used gravity to propel it from west to east. And when it got to the bottom, it's 40 foot below the ground. And so they needed steam engines to raise the ordure and dump it into the river where it was wider and get it out into the North Sea. You wouldn't do it like that way today, but that was the best solution they came up with at the time. And that is the building that we had to come up with a strategy for restoring. It was the only Grade 1 listed building in southeast London apart from Tower Bridge. And over 15 years working with them and sharing the trust, we managed to construct a strategy to create it as a museum. We raised money from the Heritage Lottery Fund, from the Department of Communities and Local Government, and from business. So, and the work of restoring the place and opening a museum is still going on as I speak. So I don't have experience of running a museum, but I do have experience of trying to imagine a museum and raising money for one. I really enjoyed that initial experience. And I'm really pleased that I'm at the Arts Council now, where I can help, try to help at any rate, ensure the future of our museum sector. As you know, at Arts Council England, we do this via Renaissance funding, of course, and part of that we have the Strategic Support Fund, so we can support excellence in museums, whatever their size and type. But we also back you up by arguing the case for funding with central government. And as you know, we did have a success earlier this year. It's odd to celebrate grim news, but we got out of the Chancellor a much smaller cut than he was threatening, and that will make a difference to us in 15-16. We also try to encourage local councils to continue investing in museums and galleries even in tough times. I spend nearly all of my time crisscrossing the country, sitting down with council leaders, and I'll say more about that in a minute. By finding ways to increase the contribution that philanthropy makes, and by working to improve the resilience of every organisation's business model, adopting new strategies, for instance, and I'm going to say more about that later. Now, in my first few months, I've seen some inspirational things, and you'll have to forgive me, David, but I will insist on a note of celebration. I don't dispute the things you said, and I don't dispute the reasons you said them, but I have seen some amazing things going around the country. I've visited museums in Brighton, Ipswich, Leicester, Sunderland, among others, and everywhere I've gone, I have been really impressed by the enterprise and innovation and the kind of ideas that are inspiring us across the cultural sector. Last month, I was at the reopening of the Cheltenham Art Gallery, a museum now renamed the Wilson, after the local explorer and doctor and artist. This beautiful new building cost £6 million. The money was raised across both public and private sectors. £2.5 million from Cheltenham Borough Council, and we absolutely applaud them for their commitment. £750,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund, £2 million from trusts and foundations, and £200,000 from smaller individual donations. So it's a great example of what can be achieved with that mixture of public money and philanthropy. They're also using technology that I hope we're going to see more widely applied. They've got a smartphone app, which the Arts Council gave them £70,000 to develop. A couple of weeks ago also I was in Hull, which as you know is shortlisted for the City of Culture, and I visited the Hull History Centre, which has this busy programme of local engagement, drop-in family history sessions, and indeed this Sunday they're going to show some special footage of BFI Rugby League dating back to Edwardian times. Now in the new years, some of you will know they're moving to a new building made possible with a £7.7 million grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. It's going to house a groundbreaking partnership between the Hull City Council and the University of Hull. And that's an example of partnerships between higher education institutions and city councils that are beginning to be a really dynamic force. It's a model for the collaboration I hope we'll see more of. So I've seen excellent art and craft, new buildings, partnership, innovation, engagement, and vision. I have seen all these things in the last few months. So looking at the title of the conference, responding to what David said, there's no crisis, I think, in the ambition and values in our museums. I've read Museums Changes Lives, and it's a document of a sector that I think is very aware of its potential and ambitious to realize it. It tells us that museums are trusted by the public, and very popular too. More than half the adult population visited a museum in 2012. It tells us that museums enrich individual lives and contribute to strong communities and create a better society. It also tells us that museums benefit from engaging with their public and bringing them, their skills, and their creativity into the buildings. So museums changes lives does not paint a picture of a sector fading away, David. It really doesn't. It gives us a vision of a sector that's reinvigorating itself through different sorts of partnerships, in funding, in skills, and in thinking. It gives us examples of how museums can help the young, the marginalised, and older people. It tells us, for instance, about the House of Memories here at the Museum of Liverpool, a project that's working with partners in the health and charitable sectors to help people living with dementia. And the work being done in Colchester and Ipswich museums to give homeless people a sense of status. And it urges more museums to use their resources to engage with their communities. I'll say a bit more about how I think all of us have got to get that message of the holistic value of culture in society over. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. At the Arts Council, as you may know, we've just published our refreshed 10-year strategy, allowing us to bring together our responsibilities across arts, museums, and libraries. It expresses exactly the kind of ambition and courage that you're articulating yourselves. Now, as you know, we took over from the MLA a couple of years ago, and this is our way of ensuring that museums are at the heart of what the Arts Council does. And I was very pleased that we recently appointed Julie Finch, Director of Bristol's Museums and Galleries and Archives, to the Arts Council to keep us focused on this. I might say I'm equally sorry we're going to lose her to Perth in Australia next year, but congratulations to her, of course, but we will maintain such strong representation of the museum sector on the Arts Council after that. So right now, I think the excellence and breadth of our museums are the envy of other nations. Everywhere you go, you find museums that not only boast superb and stimulating collections, but which do great things with them. Because of this excellence, they're also valuable parts of their communities. From large to small, across content, across funding streams, from those in receipt of public funds to small independent museums. You may have seen last week's report, a lot of reports in the last 2 or 3 weeks, which put our consumption of culture as a nation above that of France and Italy. I found myself on Sky News, supposedly to reply to a patriotic riposte from a French journalist. But instead, she got on the air and did my job for me. She lauded our cultural offer to the skies, particularly praising the power of free entry to museums. So now it seems to be recognised in Europe that we do have something special. So back to your theme, and perhaps the core of your theme, and certainly your theme, David, is there a crisis financially? Well, of course we can't pretend things aren't very, very hard, and there are huge challenges. The Arts Council grant in aid from central government, that's the taxpayer money that we receive, is down a third over 4 years. Local authority funding for the arts is also down, as David was saying, with cuts to arts and culture budgets predicted to be around 7% next year. Now, we know museums are dependent on local authority funding and how hurtful this is. Local authority funding for museums is more than £200 million, and that's, of course, 4 or 5 times the money the Arts Council invests. We also know, and I made a reference to it just now, that the next funding round, our major partner museums face a 5% cut from 15-16, just like our other regularly funded organisations in the arts. I know that a quarter of you have had to reduce public access, and more than 40% of you have had to lose staff, and that is extremely tough. David gave us a frightening list of cancellations. But, and there is a but, as Museums Changes Lives highlights, we also know, and that document sets it out, that there is a way through this, through diversifying our work, our audiences, and our funding. And these are all part of the same ambitious approach. And I see this conference, the lively debates you have, the record attendance at it. We all know that retrenchment is a shortcut to mediocrity, and I don't see you people in the debates you're having and the ambition you're expressing, I don't see you losing your ambition or losing the public. Now, at the Arts Council, our support programme Renaissance is currently worth £43 million a year. As I think you know, there are 4 strands to this. Part of it is that we invest £20 million a year in 16 major partner museums or consortia. Then another part of it is the Strategic Support Fund, which supports best practice and innovation across museums. We're committing little more than 42 million out of Renaissance to this over 3 years. Since 2012, it's invested in 181 projects. Round 3's recently opened. We've reduced the minimum bid from 50,000 to 30,000 to extend its ambit, and we hope to push that process further in the future. And we are now committed to the scheme up to 2018. There are also funding streams for museum development, and there are national initiatives which include support for schemes like Kids in Museums and Museums at Night, and the designation scheme that promotes best regional collections. And importantly, working with the Department of Education, we run the Schools and Museums programme, for which 3.6 million is made available to fund school trips to museums. Again, I take note of the statistics on the reduction in school visits. I think we ought to look at that over 3 years, but that needs very closely monitoring. It is obviously an area of concern. There's also grants for the arts scheme, a separate scheme we have funded by Arts Council National Lottery income, and that's available to museums interested in arts-based projects. It's helped a lot of organisations think differently about their collections and how they might use them to bring in new audiences. To give a couple of examples, in the Southwest, New Expressions Initiative helps museums to commission work aimed at bringing in new audiences. It's also funded the Natural History Museum to create an international artist residency programme. I do think the use of lottery money can bring a museum more into the public eye and can highlight the valuable work it does in other areas. So David talks about the imbalance between London and the regions, and I'll repeat what I said on the Today programme just a couple of weeks ago when that report came out. I said I welcomed it. I think it makes a really good point. There's clearly an imbalance between London and the regions. Let me just clarify why we took issue with the numbers. There are many ways you can cut the numbers on how the money is given to London and the regions. And there is, let me repeat again, I agree, an imbalance between London and the regions. But there are many ways you can cut it. You can cut it the way the report cut it. You can cut it by looking at subsidy per attendee. And if you cut it that way, London gets one of the lowest subsidies, in fact. And you should also look at the importance of the national institutions in London and at the work that they do nationally outside London, as well as the fact that they happen to have headquarters in London. All of those are aspects to it, and if the report had given a broad view, it would have included those factors. But that doesn't change the fact there's been an imbalance. And I said on the radio, and I'll say it to you again here today, judge us in a couple of years. We recognise the imbalance. We have to do something about it. But you know, where museums specifically are concerned, and where the Arts Council is concerned, if you have an argument with the money that goes to the national museums, which goes to them direct from the government, that is your argument with the government. The Arts Council is responsible, as you know, for the Renaissance Fund. And if you take, for instance, the major museum partner funding, 90% of that goes to outside London. So where museums specifically are concerned, overall I agree there's an imbalance and there's one the Arts Council has to address. But where museums specifically are concerned, I think your argument is with the funding of the national museums and not with the Arts Council. Most of the flagships I'm talking about have their own funding relationships with the government, and our responsibility is to encourage that overall ecology. We'll always argue strongly for the importance of it. Now, I want to say a bit about local authorities, and of course we understand the pressures they're under. But we always urge local authorities to consider the contribution the cultural sector makes. Almost every week, I sit down with local politicians to remind them that arts and culture may not be a statutory obligation, but they're an essential service, and that their quality of life, locally, pride of place and tourist offer depend on it, and that the Arts Council is here to partner with local authorities. It's tough, but in many cities, the message is getting through. And I hear what you say, David, about Liverpool, the most recent visitor numbers to Liverpool. Of course, the visitor numbers to Liverpool up to 2012 was a really good news story. And when you sit down with Joe Anderson and he calls culture the rocket fuel for the regeneration of his city, and he looks in your eyes as he says it, the elected mayor, you know he means it, like the elected mayors of Bristol and Leicester also mean it. And this is about civic leadership. And I am meeting some really interesting and dynamic civic leadership in Britain, dealing with the problems. I would like to say specifically about Liverpool that it has very, very tough decisions to take, like many of the cities, but it is a shining example of how a cultural offer can regenerate a city. And that cannot be taken away, and it's an example to other civic leaders. And I must say that elected mayors are a brilliant thing. They, above party politics, they give great leadership. Now, it's hard when people are faced with cuts to frontline services, cuts that affect people they care for, to decide how the public money should be spent. But we also know that to get our local economies working and to create jobs, we have to attract businesses, and businesses want to locate themselves in places where there's a rich cultural life. The main reason Newcastle drew back from 100% cut to its arts and cultural budget, the main reason was that local businesses went into revolt and said, what are you trying to do to the reputation of our city? Now, if I may switch to a word or two about what I call the digital dividend. The digital revolution is giving museums a great opportunity to reach more people. Upward mobility, I call it, we're the upward mobility generation. More than half adults now have a smartphone. And, you know, in the apps that we're seeing, it's not about taking people away from the live experience. The live and physical, I think, gets more special in an age of infinite replicability. This is a bonus helping create a new public and bringing more of the public to that live experience. Last year's figures from DCMS show that 30% of adults visited a museum website, up 16% from 2006, and 17% of them were taking a virtual tour of the museum. At the Arts Council, we're providing funds for digital research and development and for skills, and we're exploring all sorts of partnerships across digital streaming that will open up public access to all cultural organizations, including museums, galleries, and libraries. And we're also helping to connect organizations so they can work together. One example, and you heard from their chair yesterday, is Oxford Aspire, the consortium of university and county council museums that we fund as a major partner museum. Their Thames Valley Museums Group website brings together 60 museums in one portal to let the 5 million annual visitors to those museums know what else is available in their area. The Arts Council put strategic funds into the website, and we also gave Oxford Aspire funds to help develop a smartphone app to help visitors explore Oxford's museums. So there are many ways to get people involved. You need me to wind up. I will do so. I wanted to say I was delighted to see that Full Steam Ahead from Brunel's Essex, Great Britain, and the Science Museum got a Tiger Award last year, but that's perhaps a discussion for another time. Everyone agrees that effective modern marketing begins with data. It can be very hard to monitor a footfall in a free environment, but we have to find ways around it, and that's a very important part in the future of both attracting people in and raising philanthropic capital. I also was in Hull recently and was very impressed at the plans they have to share data between their museum sector, their library services, and their other arts institutions. One of the obstacles we face in diversifying our revenues is public perception. Only 9%, a recent survey we carried out, said that people realized that arts and cultural organizations are charities. That's something we have to change. We have to change that perception, and we have to get over the arguments for the holistic value of arts and culture. And I would recommend you go to the Arts Council website and look at a new diagram we've put together, which summarizes the holistic case for public support of the arts, which is going to be a very important part of our weaponry in the next 2 years running up to the general election, about the advantages to culture, society, education, and the economy. Have a look at that and tell us what you think of it. Now, in the museum sector, you're already thinking along these lines, and you articulate in Museums Changing Lives. In conclusion, a word about the Science Museum, who are opening their Collider exhibition today, bringing together architects, playwrights, and video designers to tell the story of the search for the Higgs boson. To the outside world, it can seem sometimes that the value of our arts and our wider culture of our museums, galleries, and libraries is like that particle, central, ubiquitous, crucial, but hard to grasp for some people. I think in the museum sector, you're making a great case for the existence of that precious particle. We should be immensely proud of our museums. I know everybody in this room is. I believe their relationship with the Arts Council has opened up opportunities on all sides. I look forward to that relationship getting closer as we work together. It is an absolutely massive challenge, but looking around this room, hearing about the debates you had yesterday, I cannot believe we apply the word crisis to it. but we have a massive argument to make in the next 18 months running up to the general election. And we have much ground to get back, and the pressures are huge. I would not deny that for a moment. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, David. We've got a little bit of time for questions. So can we get the lights up, please? And there are standing mics, 1, 2, 3, 4. Can I see the first person who would like to ask a question? We have to keep it brief, succinct, to the point.
Yeah, Ruth Hecht from Bristol Museums, Galleries and Archives. Given that you've acknowledged that there is a big disparity, and the reports acknowledge the disparity between London and the regions, given that yesterday one of the talks was a director from a national London-based organisation who was very clear that he didn't feel that that they should come out to the regions, that everyone should travel into London, and that they didn't really have responsibility for lending out works to the regions. What do you think, how do you think the national organisations can work with the regions more in a more equitable way?
Thank you. Who wants to go first? Peter?
Yeah. A lot of this is to do with the museum sector, and a lot of it is to do with the broader arts sector. But we have a new national portfolio organisation round coming up next year. As many of you will know, the applications go in January, and the decisions are made by June. And we will be requiring national organisations to do more for the whole country, and it happens in a number of ways. I'm afraid I'll give some examples of outside the museum sector, but if you take the National Theatre, its NT Live, not only is in 365 cinemas around the country, and has attracted an audience of 2 million since it started, takes its productions, but it's now opening up its network to small theatrical productions from all around the country. An example recently was Kenneth Branagh's Macbeth from Manchester International Festival. So in many ways, and then they have to do more. And that means we need to get behind touring more. Again, that's less of a museums issue. But remember that where the Arts Council is concerned, you know, we don't have an imbalance in the way, we don't actually have an imbalance between London and the regions in the way we fund museums, because we're responsible for a relatively small part of it. So you're asking me, once again, to debate the broader issue, and I do urge you to aim your very good arguments at the government, because it is they who have the deal with the national museums, and we're not part of that deal. But the way we fund touring, again, you'll find that of the arts and cultural organisations in London that are funded by us, about 2/3 of them tour. No, half of them tour, and 2/3 of those tours are outside London. So in a whole set of different ways, we have to make sure that the large national institutions live up to the word national.
I think there's a point to be made about it not just being about money, it's about your obligation to the rest of the sector and the public.
Exactly.
Can we see the next question?
Yes, good morning. Edmund Southworth, currently the director of Manx National Heritage, which is a trust generating its own funding with government support. The next crisis that is looming is the result of the headlong flight away from the public sector into charitable trusts. And could you consider how you're going to encourage the smaller trust to compete with government-sponsored agencies like the Canal and River Trust and the new English Heritage Trust, which, when combined with the resources of the National Trust and some of the other bigger operations, are going to wipe the floor in terms of fundraising with many of the smaller organisations. And many of these organisations are badly managing a flight into trust status, which will rebound on them in 10 years' time when the current enthusiasm goes and they have to refresh their board, their fundraising, their galleries.
Would you, don't leave the mic, would you like to just give a quick example? Or, you know, you say it's the next crisis looming, but give a quick example of... I
used to manage Lancashire County Museums,
yeah.
And one of the TV programmes that fascinates everyone is behind the scenes at the museum, the Commercial Vehicle Museum in Leyland, which was in that cycle. It operated fantastic for 20 years, and then the local authority removed its small grant, £40,000 a year. Suddenly it tipped into crisis. And there is an inevitable refresh cycle of governance in small trusts. But fundraising in a small community, in a deprived community in the northwest of England is not the same as fundraising in a big urban environment or in the M25 zone.
Yeah.
If I may, Edmund, can we broaden that into the whole philanthropy debate? Because, I mean, that's at the heart of it, really, isn't it? Is there enough cash out there to make up for the shortfall in public funding? David, do you want
Well, no, there isn't, is there? I'm not quite sure how it is I get somebody to pay for cleaning the windows at National Museums Liverpool. You know, it's not a particularly attractive proposition, either philanthropic or sponsorship. Obviously, this is a bit of a mantra at the moment that we can reduce the amount of public expenditure because somebody somewhere else will pick up the tab. Well, some people may believe that. I happen to be one of the people that think it's not going to happen. It may well again be part of the if you're looking through London tinted spectacles, it might just be possible. But all I'm looking for from national bodies is realism about the the realistic prospects of trying to raise money in a city like Liverpool, for example, or Hull, or Leicester, or Leeds, or Newcastle, or Sunderland, to replace the public expenditure that's poured in from the whole nation over a long period, expecting somehow or other that the private sector is going to pick up the public sector bills. Well, you know, I happen to be one of the people that believes it's just not going to happen.
Peter, is the
but David, you would not disagree, I think, that there is more we can and should do to raise funds. We all accept that fundraising outside London, I mean, in arts and culture, 80% of the funds raised go to 50 institutions in London. So that just underlines yet another imbalance. We're well aware of that. But we've had responsibility of the Arts Council now for a couple of years for philanthropic strategy. I believe we're only just starting. And we need to develop some much better strategies for raising money, for getting local communities to support institutions, for getting them to understand what tax breaks are. Half of that's not understood. For getting the baby boomer generation who have money in all across the country behind these things. There are many things we have to do, not least in our relationship with community foundations, who are beginning to play a really important role raising money locally in all areas. And in fact, they are the people who've taken responsibility for the arts and cultural budget in Newcastle. They're using the £600,000 from the City Council to try to leverage that against donations from business and individuals and trusts. But look, the gentleman's question was about the difficulty of fundraising for very small institutions. And he's absolutely right. Nobody in the Arts Council, and you'll never hear me say it is a way of replacing government money or a reason for cutting government expenditure. I will never say that. But I will say, out of necessity, we have to do better at fundraising. And we have to find ways of doing it.
I agree with you, Peter, but the trouble is that I've been working very hard to raise money from the private sector for a long time. I'm not being defeatist, I'm trying to be realistic about what the realistic prospects are. And no amount of political rhetoric is going to magic up great sums of money from the private sector. And you might say, I take your point, you've never said it's to replace public sector funding. There are others that essentially are saying that. It's not going to happen. I don't want... what irritates me a little bit about this is the suggestion that people like me, because we say it's not going to happen, are being defeatist. That's just not the case. I've tried as hard as anybody. We've got teams of people trying to raise money from all over the place in National Museums Liverpool. Yeah. It's not there to raise. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so please don't make out that there's something wrong with our attitude.
Would you agree with me that in the next 4 or 5 years we could do better with fundraising than we're currently doing? Would you agree that it is possible to improve it? Or are you saying it's not possible to improve it?
Well, I'm saying that there's wishful thinking on the one hand and there's realistic prospects on the other.
You won't find wishful thinking from me. I'm a realist. But is it possible to improve it?
I'd like to think that we could raise more than we are doing.
Good. It's not a replacement for public expenditure. It's bloody tough. It's incredibly difficult outside London. All of those things are true, but we have to try to improve it, and it is possible to improve it. We have to give it our best go.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Levitt, Arts and Museums, Leicester City Council. This is a very quick one. Just to say thank you to both of you for your kind words about Leicester. Also, it is fantastic to have a city mayor who values culture. It is indeed the rocket fuel of regeneration, and thank you. It's really tough in Leicester, like it is everywhere else. But to know that right at the top of our local authorities, that there are people who value what we do is fantastic. And I think that's a really great message that everyone here should be going back, whether you're experiencing huge cuts or whatever. So thank you very much for your kind words. Our city mayor is on his way to Derry too, because we're shortlisted for the City of Culture as well. And it's just going to be a fantastic experience, whatever the outcome. Thank you very much.
Do you think it might be possible just to ask everybody in the hall on a show of hands whether the local authority that you happen to be with, the one you work with and are funded by, believes, never mind about what its pressure is on its spending for one moment, but does it believe in the power of arts and culture? Those who think they work with the local authority that does believe in the power of arts and culture genuinely. And those that believe it doesn't get it at all. That's immensely, that's not immensely, it's quite depressing, because I'd say about a third of you think your local authority doesn't get it. And that's a really interesting thing, because, God, we've got some work to do there.
There is work to be done. We're going to have to crack on with these questions. Sam, do you want to?
Yeah, I think one suggestion that might be helpful. Sam Mullins, London Transport Museum. This country is already incredibly philanthropic in terms of mass philanthropy. We support all kinds of charitable giving, whether it's for overseas disaster aid or cats and dogs. One of the problems I think we have is that the museums aren't recognised sufficiently as being a charitable cause like those others. And the other problem we have, which you might be able to help solve, Sir Peter, is that the Treasury thinks gift aid is some kind of a scam rather than mass philanthropy. And if we could change that mindset, I think I've asked this question 2 years to folks from DCMS at this conference, that would be really helpful. My own museum has to be a charging museum, and we make $250,000 a year from gift aid. And we'd like to see the government get behind gift aid as a sort of brand for mass philanthropy, because it's an untapped opportunity.
Can we just take the other... Sorry, Janet, do you want to ask your question, and then you, Mike, and then we'll respond and complete?
I'm Janet Dugdale, Director of Museum of Liverpool. I think both Peter and David did actually talk about a very, very real crisis, which is one of the impacts of these cuts, and that is if young people, school children and families are not visiting our museums right across the country. And Peter said it needed monitoring. I think it needs much more than monitoring. It's really serious if we don't invest in our young people, in the kind of places that we all run, safe places, neutral places, where there's a lot of opportunity for expression and exploring difficult subjects. If people are not able to engage in museums, particularly our youngest children, then I think that is a very real crisis, and we're throwing away all the really good work of the last 20 years. And I'd like to know what both of you think should be done about that.
Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, hello, Michael Day, Historic Royal Palaces. I recognise that what I'm about to say is going to be controversial in some quarters, and I know that, Peter, it's not your issue, but we still seem to be unable to debate the charging admissions in National Museums question at a time of this real crisis. The question is, in the end, who should pay for our museums? And in the great nationals, it's very much the taxpayer and the government and not the user. There are many, many users of those museums who I'm sure would be only too happy to pay. And I suspect we're turning down in the order of £250 to £300 million every year from people who would probably quite willingly contribute to solving this problem.
Thank you, Mike. So can both David and Peter answer those points, in particular on free admission? Should we reintroduce charging?
Do you want to?
Well, I mean, you could. I've always been in favour of free admission on the grounds that, you're removing every barrier you can to getting people to get value out of what we do. But I absolutely understand that where you've got a tourist economy, it could be different. I think my answer to this would be, the answer's maybe, Mike, but I'd like to think there's some bloody policy somewhere where we actually are able to discuss these things and have a rationale. Because if London's different, let's decide it's different and not better than what's happening elsewhere. This is one of the problems. It's just we kind of exist in a bit of a policy-free zone, and I don't know what that policy is really meant to achieve. I don't know if anybody here does really. It looks quite good. It's great that we've got free access in Liverpool. I'm not so sure whether it will be the same in one of the world's great, you know, mega capital cities like London. It's a different set of issues.
I'm just going to suggest my colleague John Ornstein goes to the mic and might want to say something about the school children survey and what we think about that. John, you may have a view on that, but just to give you time to get there. Because I think that survey is very important, and we were discussing it the other day. On the broader question, we are a charitable nation, but we're less charitable to arts and culture, and that's one of the challenges we have. And I agree with you, the Treasury brings in tax breaks, but it doesn't like to publicise them. It was far worse when they were even saying that using them to give money was some sort of scam. I think we've got over that now, but it was a very bleak episode. But if they're not going to publicise tax breaks, we have to, and everybody in this room will be busy marketing tax breaks, but we need that nationally as well, I agree. On the question of charging, I mean, since free entry came in the 90s, there's been a sea change in attendance numbers, accessibility and everything else. And would we want to throw all that away? I doubt it, which is not to say that individual organisations shouldn't decide that for them it works to charge. And I know that's happened with, I think, Hall Place in North Bexley, which I happen to know about because it's very close to the Crossness Engines where I was working. But overall, I think we'd be throwing a lot away, personally. John, did you have a view on that?
It'll have to be very brief.
You let me near the mic now, so I think just a couple of points. Specifically on that, on the attendance of museums by school children, we're aware it is an issue, and there's growing evidence that there is a downward trend. Working with young people is one of Arts Council's 5 goals, absolutely at the heart of what Arts Council is doing. And so we're thinking now about our investment period from 15 to 18 and thinking about some new initiatives, some reallocation of funding specifically to focus on young people and on schools. And of course, the Museums and Schools programme is about £3.6 million. It's doing some good at the moment, but more needs to be done, I think. And I'm going to a future museum learning conversation in a second. A couple of other really quick things. Nicholas Penny was wrong. Nicholas Penny doesn't represent national museums, and I'm going back on the debate a little bit. And actually, national museums do have a responsibility, and lots of them play a very important role around the UK. I think there needs to be a continued grown-up conversation about what that looks like in the future. And I think just to say that Arts Council is passionate about museums and actually very much wants to be part of the conversation that David and others have talked about here, about how to make things work really well across the country. So, you know, we want to be part of that conversation in a really positive way.
Okay, thank you. One sentence, short, brief, to the point. How do we get out of this crisis, Peter?
I'm sorry, we'll still maintain we have a massive challenge, but we don't have a crisis. And the extraordinary vitality of this conference and the ideas and the debates you're having underlines that. But how we get out of it is we diversify in the way we're talking about. We're incredibly robust and imaginative. And, you know, in 3 or 4 years' time, things may just get better. But the downward pressure on local authorities is the most terrible thing to deal with.
I think there is a crisis, and until we acknowledge that there is one, and that the impact that the financial I take the financial issues as a given. Let's stop pretending that they're not having a truly awful impact on what we do, because they are. We'll never get out of it unless we admit that.
Thanks very much.